Today for our devotional, I'd like to read from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in that evil day, and having done all, to stand. Yesterday, in the early evening, I was notified that the ministries of Valley View Bible Church and Christian School received a false or fake derogatory review. And it came in the form of a review posted in the review section for businesses on Google Maps. It looked like at first glance that there was little we could really do about it. And the reason for this is that when you look at Google, it's just seen as one big, huge behemoth with no direct way to address the problem. And what I mean by that, there was no help phone number. There was no place to lodge a support ticket, nor was there any chat room for support. And it became this unseen entity out there that could do really a great deal of harm. Now, we were fortunate in that after doing some research and praying about it and contacting our people, Google removed the particular review that was offensive. And we give all the praise for that to the Lord Jesus Christ, because this is not typical of what happens when you get a false review on Google. And this incident reminds me of our passage. You see, our real enemy isn't Google or Facebook or the internet or anything else like that. But our real enemy, besides ourselves, is unseen. It's hidden. And it's extremely dangerous. And frankly, it cannot be defeated with the wisdom of men or with man's power. Paul put it well in Ephesians chapter 6 here, our passage, and in verse 12, I think. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. What we see in our world really is only a manifestation of demonic powers in high places, influencing people in high places of government and business, and frankly in society as a whole. And these demonic influences have targeted believers and the church. But what we need to remember is that the attacks we face really come from three sources. And we see that spelled out, I think, fairly clearly in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sin, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince and power of the air, the spirit that now works in the sons of disobedience, and among whom also we once conducted ourselves in the lusts of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as others. So when we look at these sources, these three sources, the first one is that world system. And what we mean by that is the collective worldview of fallen man. It is that worldview which is at enmity with God. And we read about that, for instance, in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. And do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of this world. And the world is passing away, and the lusts of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. And then there's also James chapter 4, verse 4. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And the second thing that wars against us is our own flesh. James chapter 1 verse 14 says, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And then also in Romans chapter 7 verses 23 and 24, Paul describes the struggle that he had even with the flesh, where we read, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And of course, the third thing that wars against us is the devil and his minions. What we're really talking about here is demonic powers under the direction of the devil, which is what our passage that we started off with is specifically speaking to. And we read about that as well in passages like James chapter 4 and verse 7. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee you. Or 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But these demonic powers that we read about in verse 12, and they're expressed also in these last two verses, they are unseen. We can't necessarily grab a hold of them. There is no way to physically stop these things. They are not of flesh and blood, as Paul tells us. But rather, what we wrestle against are principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places, as verse 12 tells us. So as you see, there's no support ticket here. There's no chat room for support. There's no place that we can email someone or contact someone. What we need to do is put on the whole armor of God if we plan to stand against these forces, as we read in verse 13. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in that evil day, and having done all, to stand. But even if that's the case, that we put on that whole armor, we must realize, as I shared in our last devotional, that God is our ultimate refuge. Psalm 46 and verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The armor of God, as we shall see in my next devotional, is found in the armory of God. We need to approach the throne of God, and we need to realize that that armor comes from God, and He empowers that very armor. And that we don't stand alone, but rather by His power and His enablement. So, while the war is won, the battles are still raging.